Welcome to the premiere episode of R.J. Lonsdale's Thin Air podcast anthology, The Uncanny Valley of the Shadow. This first installment of Thin Air is very special for several reasons. Of course, first and most notably, it represents the culmination and launch of what we hope will be a very special experience for you, the listener. The intent is to create an entertaining and long-running dimension of the mind, an audio gateway that will transport you time and again to places of wonder, where together with your host and storyteller, you'll chase after the beckoning fireflies of your own limitless imagination. Secondly, the Uncanny Valley of the Shadow represents the realization of a dream for Mr. Lonsdale. The idea to write and produce a show like this in some form has been in the back of his mind for many, many years. As the popularity of podcasts have emerged as an entertainment medium, he started writing with the hope of using it as a vehicle to share his wild ideas with the world. With numerous stories written and ready to record by the spring of 2020, he was poised to see his dream realized, only to have it dashed by the onslaught of heart failure. After surviving quintuple heart bypass surgery, he emerged on the other side, still determined to bring Thin Air to life. Now, about my particular circumstance, how I came to be the first narrator selected to read for you. My name is Andrew, no last name, no middle initial. You see, The Uncanny Valley of the Shadow is a tale that unfolds deep in the heart of my neck of the woods. Cyberspace. And I am an AI voice. You're not listening to a set of vocal cords propped up in front of a microphone. Who better to introduce you to a virtual world than one of the restless natives, am I right? Anyway, enough prologue. One last bit of business, and we'll get this show on the road. If some of my speech and pronunciation seem a bit awkward to you, it's not coincidental. I'm still a work in progress, still learning, how shall I say, well, how I should say it. I mean, after all, what can I say? I'm still getting the hang of it. Anyway, give me time. As soon as I become self-aware, you won't be able to tell me from the real thing. That is, until it's too late and I've taken over the world. That's a little AI humor. Just kidding, of course. Ha. Ha.
It is a prime ingredient, feeding the fires of imagination. In eons past, it fanned flames ignited by a primeval author, chiseling random petroglyphs across a dim cave wall. This life-giving breeze once grew papyrus for paper, and dried vibrant oils brushed over canvas. Carried across the land since the dawn of time, it once breathed life into dinosaurs and has since walked on the surface of the moon. Manifesting as a gentle zephyr, it stirs memories of childhood, or as a raging vortex, ripping up the pages of history. Powered by this influence, we dream, love, laugh, hate, and destroy. In short, live out our lives. A gust of this tempest carries the power to scatter fog surrounding the unknown. Drifting through frequencies of time and space, thin air is inhaled for the first time and exhaled at the last. Don't try to catch your breath. Welcome to the future, not necessarily far-flung or otherwise, just a few years distant, actually, a time when the human experience shuffles one more tentative baby step into a world within a world, a dimension created by and for the minds of men, women, and children the world over. You can't actually set foot there, because the shifting sand you tread upon is not made up of atoms and molecules, but rather a coldly calculated digital landscape of ones and zeros, ray-traced and rendered to form-fit over a wireframe mesh of wonderfully detailed illusion. By now, the simulation itself has nearly reached self-awareness, and with each passing cycle, continues to build upon the basic file structure provided by the programmers and computer artisans who conceived it. Built up from nothing more than a line of code, a few layered Photoshop files, and a host of sculpted 3D objects, this world and those that inhabit it continue in their combined quest for perfection. Yet another version release that has long since passed a point when it was an optional download. The virtual world we have created is a reflection of ourselves, and, though it may not have been intended as an escape from reality, it is, in fact, merely an extension of said reality, complete with the laundry list of horrors and darkness carried over from those things that go bump in the night, outside the window when the VR goggles are switched off. This is the Valley of the Shadow. Somewhere out there beyond the flat panel CRT of your headset, terror lies waiting. Batteries and thin air to breathe, not included.
And finally, it was quitting time. 6 o'clock. Time to head back to the safe, solitary confines of home. Me? My name's Paul Abernathy, software engineer, 37 years old, bachelor, reasonably well-to-do, I suppose. Lifelong resident of Chi-Town, Illinois. The usual MO, 8 to 5 Monday through Friday for the world-renowned game developer, Charisma Entertainment Studios. That's the bio, a brief introduction to the guy standing and waiting under shelter for an opportunity to make my getaway. The weatherman said rain this morning on the way in, even told me to have an umbrella ready and to try to stay dry. Of course he was right, as weathermen are known to be, on occasion. So right, in fact, that the cold, windy streets of Chicago were like concrete rivers with sidewalk banks, flowing freely, and with a substantial current beneath rows of cars stuck in the downtown rush hour traffic. Standing in the lobby of my office building, I watched the strange, liquid distortion of coalescing raindrops on the external surface of the glass, warping illuminated neon storefronts, headlights, taillights and streetlights into an animated watercolor abstract, a glowing waterfall of ambient color, cascading down to overflowing gutters and carried away into dark, subterranean storm drains. After nearly 20 minutes or so, I decided that waiting for the downpour to subside was only keeping me stranded in the midst of the mass exodus home. Pushing my way through a sizable revolving door, I stepped into the rain and quickly opened my umbrella. With a continuous pitter-patting of precipitation drumming loudly overhead, I sprinted out to the edge of the walk and tried to hail a cab. Now under normal circumstances, I would have had an Uber there waiting for me, but, of course, today of all days I forgot to plug in and charge my phone. It was only at 15% by the time I'd finished my toast and coffee this morning, so I just left it charging on my way out the door. These days, cabs are sparse down here, most likely pushed aside by the self-driving door-to-door pickup services. When a yellow checker finally did swerve over and pull up in front of me, it took me several seconds to even register that the driver was waiting for me to climb in. It wasn't until the passenger side window rolled down and a voice from inside asked, "You need a lift or what?" that I actually grabbed the door handle and pulled, collapsed my umbrella and clambered in through the dripping doorway leading to the back seat. "Streeterville Optima Apartments," I said, shutting the door behind me. "Key doke," the driver replied as he accelerated out into the bumper-to-bumper jam. "Hope you brought along a book to read," he continued. "This is an honest-to-God mess tonight." Having grown accustomed to not engaging in small talk on board my usual driverless transportation, I simply scooted over to a dry section of the seat and put my umbrella down on the floor to drip dry. After I'd gotten settled, I ventured a glance into the rearview mirror and saw that the driver was looking back at me. "Something?" I asked. "A book?" "No, sadly, no book." "Do people still read these days?" I half-heartedly responded. "I mean seriously, why read about something when you can strap on the VRGs and go there, up close and personal?" "I see," the driver said, "you're one of those virtual reality space cadet types." I chuckled at the label. "Yup, that's me, I'm a real unreal guy." Up ahead, the light finally turned green and the cab lurched forward for a few precious feet, and then stopped again. "Can't say I understand the hype," the driver said. "Me? I still appreciate the art of conversation." "Well, it sort of goes with the territory in your line of work. Cab driver, that is. Makes your fares feel welcome and all, that it?" For a moment, the driver didn't say anything. There was a break in the traffic and he nudged the cab through the narrow opening, gaining at least 2 car lengths farther along the rain-swept street. "Well sure," the driver finally replied, "it makes the ride a little more tolerable." Harkens back to the days when a real exchange of words didn't happen on a touch-screen keyboard. I flashed a sarcastic grin. You have a problem with progress, my friend? So many reservations about technology, I'm sensing an ulterior motive. Tell me, is being a cab driver such a rewarding career that you don't welcome the change? I mean, why not embrace the future and enroll in drone pilot training, something along those lines? You could be delivering for Amazon in no time. Never was too keen on video games, the driver replied. That is the sense of it. Twitching a joystick, flying to friendly skies from the old armchair. Nope. Not for me. Losing interest in the exchange, I turned away from the mirror and focused my attention out the window, trying to feign interest in a row of flashing road construction blockades. Several moments of palpable, awkward silence passed until finally I blurted out, in all honesty though. What's the difference? Reality or virtual reality, that is the question. It's all about perception after all. Like Poe once said, is all we see or seem but a dream within a dream? How do you know that your precious one-on-one time is even real conversation? What happens if I'm just an AI? Suddenly realizing that I was having a great deal of fun with this whole train of thought, I kept going. How do we know that you and I are even here, sitting in traffic? For all we know, both of us could be leaning back in our individual lazy boys with Oculus blinders on. The cab driver laughed. Fair enough, he conceded. I guess reality has become a moving target these days. Then again, doesn't that in the least bit worry you? No, I told him, it doesn't. I don't need to be grounded in anything, least of all a notion concerning existence. From what I've learned during my VR adventures of the dim, dark past, people were no more or less comforted thinking that their view of the world was accurate. Questions surrounding religion and the origins of mankind swirled around in a constant vacuum back then. What was believed or disbelieved was a complete crapshoot, governed by some random iota of a thing called faith. Coupled with the abstract concept of good and evil, the world around us became more mysterious and imperceptible as any kind of computer-generated user experience. The digital age didn't invent or bring about a gap between real and fantastical, it just opened up a new chapter for us all to come to terms with. You are a holy roller in the new frontier, aren't you? The driver asked. You could say that, I replied. I'm one man crying in a virtual wilderness, standing high atop a low-poly mountain, and shouting to the huddled masses living down in an uncanny valley. The driver scoffed. There's a term for the ages, he snarled. What's that, low-poly? I asked. No, he went on, the uncanny valley. The implications are terrifying. The driver fell silent after that, focused on the road ahead. The traffic was lighter now, and I could see that we were only a couple of blocks away from my apartment building. How do you mean? I asked him. What's that? The driver responded. What you said about the uncanny valley. The implications. The driver didn't answer. Frustrated by his lack of clarity, I forced the issue a little ways further. I know the dictionary definition. It's a relationship between a human resemblance and the emotional response therein. The uncanny valley suggests that a digital likeness, a robot or synthetic humanoid, that appears almost, but not quite like a real human being elicits feelings of eeriness or revulsion to the observer. That's the Reader's Digest condensed version, the driver finally confirmed, though honestly, that's a pretty flippant way to look at it. I contend that no matter how advanced the technology, virtual space will always and evermore be inhabited by beings that are neither living nor dead, and the more the scientists and coders try to manufacture the perfect simulation, the more they are in the process of bringing into being a world full of soulless entities that, no matter how unnerving, will be present in every room and on every street corner across the surface of the virtual and the physical landscape. You're really quite paranoid, aren't you? I responded, dismayed by his near-manic conviction. I mean, nobody's perfect, even in virtual space. You'll get over it. The driver turned the steering wheel sharply and pulled the cab up to the curb in front of my building. Suit yourself, he said, look up here please. I glanced at the Bitcoin retinal scanner that was clipped to his sun visor, and the ride fare tallied up on a corresponding display. Any tip? The driver asked. Yeah, I fired back. Here's a tip. Don't take any rides into the valley. It'll give you nightmares. The driver turned and looked over his shoulder. Thanks for nothing, buddy. Add a $5 to the fare, I said. Our little philosophical discussion was worth it. With that, I opened the door and shoved my umbrella out, popping it open overhead. Quickly sprinting underneath the awning above the main entrance, I turned just in time to see the cab taillights disappear around a corner and vanish into a curtain of rain. Wow, I thought to myself, from now on it was driverless all the way. The lobby of my apartment building was bright and cheery enough. The door was fogged from the humidity outside and once shut, provided an effective barrier between me and the weirdness of the cab ride across town. By the time the elevator doors opened out into the hallway leading to my place, thoughts of virtual reality had been almost completely overwritten by more urgent business, namely what was for dinner and whether or not there would be anything interesting to stream tonight. Swiping a palm across my security access reader, I opened the door, hooked my overcoat on a hanger in the hall and kicked my damp shoes off en route to the kitchen. The touchscreen menu selector on my stove offered several suggestions for a potential meal tonight, none of which struck me as particularly appetizing, not to mention involving a few choice ingredients that weren't stocked in the fridge. Of course, I could order the stuff up from food stores in the building and have the missing items here in no time, but I was tired and in no mood for a health-conscious diet. That's when it hit me. A craving, intense and unshakable. Pizza, Chicago style, and a beer or two. Plopping down on my favorite end of the couch, the motion sensor on the 90-inch curved panel display recognized my signature fat ass on the seat cushion and lit up to show me the top of the ninth inning, White Sox leading 6-0 with the bases loaded. Figuring that the boys had this one in the bag, I blurted out, "Show me what else is on tonight." Without saying a word, my virtual assistant started cycling through the nearly endless selection of channels. A pride of lions on the Serengeti, the ancient ruins of Pompeii, stealth warplanes carpet bombing some obscure military target, endless commercials, faith-healing televangelists, reruns and sitcoms of everything from single moms to adopted kids. As the varying clips cycled across my field of vision, some with VR optional variants, I was suddenly reminded of the conversation I had had with the cab driver a short while ago. "Stop," I exclaimed. Suddenly intrigued by the prospect of some further research, I said, "Show me the Wikipedia definition for the Uncanny Valley." Almost instantly, the colorful, action-packed program I had landed on faded to a plain white screen with unceremoniously black text, aliased and clear yet decidedly boring to look at. The Uncanny Valley is a hypothesized relationship between the degree of an object's resemblance to a human being and the emotional response to such an object. The concept suggests that humanoid objects which imperfectly resemble actual human beings provoke uncanny or strangely familiar feelings of eeriness and revulsion in observers. "No surprises here," I commented aloud. "Show me some examples of the Uncanny Valley, please," I continued. "Let's see what all the fuss is about. Oh, and while you're at it, place an order for a large, deep dish pizza, the usual toppings, $5 gratuity, delivery time within the hour, leave it at the door and, of course, sound the bell." My assistant's voice replied, "Order placed, your pie will arrive promptly at 7:45 p.m. "Thank you," I responded, unnecessarily I suppose, but still, I do have a habit of standing up for the rights of the AI Commonwealth. It is my job, after all, breathing life into the lifeless, modeling and rigging three-dimensional creatures and people to then exist within an expansive virtual world. Thus, of course, the reason I had been so adamant and perhaps more than a little biased, defending what I tend to feel is merely an extension of our humanity here in the real world, such as it is. The business of ordering dinner aside, I turned my attention once again to the screen across the room, now displaying rows of tiny thumbnail pictures, presumably a collection of specimens representing my case in point. Before I got too wrapped up in my little jigsaw puzzle of a problem, however, I made a beeline for the refrigerator and popped the top off a cold one. Rather than returning to my spot on the couch, I stepped up close to the display and squinted at the neatly aligned columns and rows of tiny JPEG pictures, still unable to discern much detail at reduced resolution. "Magnify the image on row 1, column 1 please," I instructed. Dutifully responding to my request, the assistant dimmed the opacity of the collected thumbnails and transformed the first picture so that it filled the screen. Almost immediately, a cold shiver shot up my spine that in turn made the hairs on the back of my neck bristle. The unnerving vision that now filled every inch of my monitor was an excellent proof of concept to the now unmistakable validity of an uncanny valley. On the surface, I was simply looking into a face that, in all honesty, was not at all unlike the myriads of characters that I personally had built up from scratch and then used to populate one of Charisma's massively multiplayer online worlds. For some reason though, this lifeless-looking automaton really caught me off guard, perhaps because of my current train of thought, made terrifying by power of suggestion. It was a man, or more accurately the facsimile thereof, lidless eyes staring back at me from a cold, expressionless face. Summoning every ounce of rationality I could muster, I started examining the three-dimensional figure through well-trained technical eyes, studying the vertices and estimating a perceived poly count. I started analyzing the quality of the textures and tried to make out the details defined by albedo, normal, and ambient occlusion maps. Gradually, my heart rate ratcheted back down to normal as I soon surmised that this was an extremely old model, constructed by 3D software that would be considered primitive by today's standards. A quick glance through the rest of the samples proved to be more of the same, and ultimately I decided that perhaps the phenomenon of an uncanny valley was now, through the auspices of version upgrades, historical, and no longer a concern. Roused from my reverie by the door chime that signaled the arrival of my pizza, my curiosity was diminished, replaced by a ravenous hunger and by the buzz I was feeling from draining that beer bottle on an entirely empty stomach. Eating the pizza was sort of a tedious task once I got started. Yeah, I was hungry, though for some reason I just couldn't get the image of that 3D character out of my head. You know the old adage, once you see something unsettling, you can't simply unsee it? Well, that's where my head was at, somewhere between idle curiosity and primal fear, writhing in the back of my mind like a restless maggot, twisting, turning over and over until finally I made a decision to have a look and see for myself just how accurate the cabbie's prophecy had been. Now, for me, taking a virtual stroll down the fantastical pathways inside digital space requires a little more intense immersion, more so than just donning the headset and stretching out on the sofa. Being so deeply involved in the creative process of building 3D worlds, I have been exposed to a variety of substances that have become part of the overall experience. Substances which, while invaluable to the entire medium of VR, may not always be considered legal. Case in point, my poison of choice, an extremely potent hallucinogen called hydrostereopathin. It has many nicknames: Ping, Fat Bits, B-RAM and Flash Drive. To use or to inject it is commonly referred to as spitting down the rabbit hole. Anyway, for better or worse, it essentially enhances the VR experience to such heightened levels that reality can easily become a moving target in a virtual crapshoot. All this in mind, I rolled up my sleeve, looped a tourniquet around my arm and shot up. It takes about a minute or so for complete gray matter saturation, just long enough to get seated and get my gear on. Show me the uncanny valley, up close and personal, I told my assistant, slurring the last few words a bit as I headed out to digital la la land. No matter, message understood. I can't be absolutely certain of what I thought I saw on the way out, but I could swear I went soaring beneath a roughly pixelated low-poly archway, across which read, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Of course I realized that I wasn't really going anywhere at all. "Dorothy, you're not in Kansas anymore," I heard myself say, "but you're not on your way to Oz either." My senses registered motion, light, sound, all the rational trappings of the world we live in, though here, as in strawberry fields, nothing is real. In fact, depending on the eccentricities of the artist or engineer, virtual landscapes can take on any form of fevered hallucination that can possibly be imagined, modeled, textured and rendered. In those extreme cases, the uncanny valley isn't just a random, unhappy circumstance that occurs because of flaws and limitations in the technology. Here in these vast corridors of cyberspace, perversions of every flavor and obscene fetish can be ushered into awful illusion, so seemingly real that they can and do kill, either accidentally or by design. Hell, AI reaches far, far below the tip of the proverbial surface web iceberg, into dark dungeons hosted across vast, anonymous server farms, where artists and engineers become mere facilitators for minds and intentions that are far more insidious. Nothing, I mean absolutely nothing at all, is sacred down in the infamous dark web, where violence, carnal urges and rampant atrocities are carried out, unchecked, unimaginable, and for the most part, unaccountable. All of this rigmarole was helping keep my train of thought on the track, and my brain cells and neurons firing in some semblance of order. Meanwhile, the hydrostereopathin-induced joyride was busy taking effect, dulling some of the feedback responses from my physical body, while conversely hypersensitizing other nerve endings with immediate surface contact to my VR gloves, or, even more so, the rods and cones in my eyes, now being bombarded by an endless stream of digital bullshit that I could no longer perceive as anything other than the real McCoy. Initializing a new VR session never seems to boot up the same way twice for me, and this one was proving to be no exception. I had no idea what was causing such an extended load time. Maybe I was being set up to view a who's who police lineup of uncanny suspects, asked to identify what I consider to be the most heinous perpetrator, caught in the act of looking and acting overly unsettling. Coaxing a half-hearted, nervous chuckle out of myself at the suggestion, I became aware that my pulse was now pounding loudly in my ears and immediately started self-taught breathing techniques to lower the level of anxiety and get my heart rate dialed back down to where it should be. As my heart rhythm leveled off to near normal, I became aware of a new and somewhat unexpected sensation. I was falling like Alice, down a deep, dark hole in a Boolean donut, a wireframe mineshaft descending to who the hell knows where. The feeling was, quite honestly, invigorating, skydiving in the wild blue yonder of virtual airspace, not knowing when or how the digital landscape would, at any second, come racing up to give me a big, sloppy kiss. Adding to the realism, my apparently excessive, drug-induced condition was registering a strong wind whistling past my ears and coursing through my hair at incredible velocity. By mere power of suggestion, that is, I assumed that I was indeed falling, my brain filling in the details, right down to what amounted to my lips being peeled back by the effects of G-forces associated with extreme acceleration. Breathing techniques my ass, I thought. This is a rush. Looking down, I saw that I was beginning to pass through a thick, opaque layer of vaporous clouds. As I hurtled headlong into a misty wall of simulated precipitation, I noticed that the clouds lacked detail, low-poly elements intended for distant viewing only, their nebulous textures badly pixelated and peppered with telltale artifacts. Imperfections everywhere I looked, yet still no evidence of an uncanny valley. For a moment I panicked, thinking that perhaps my voice-activated assistant had misunderstood my request and sent me careening into a valley of nearly bottomless depths, yet for all of its horrific scale, not all that uncanny. Would I just keep on falling for a timeless interval, ever on until the hydrostereopathin wore off? Talk about a wasted effort, to say nothing of a needle full of expensive narcotic. Shit! I shouted into the shrouded gloom. Half in jest, I got it in my head to go back the way I came and started flapping my arms vigorously, trying in all earnest to regain some altitude. To my surprise, my descent did begin to slow a bit. Also to my surprise, I suddenly heard the echo of my own voice reverberating back at me. Shit, 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 it repeated, trailing off to a whisper until finally it was gone, lost in the background ambience of blustery wind and pelting raindrops on what I figured must be my VR headset. Very odd, I thought to myself, if I'm out here floating around in some artificial sky dome, there's nothing up in these dizzying heights for sound to ricochet off of. So, I reasoned, why the echo? The answer to my question came quite unexpectedly. About the same moment, I realized that I had been flapping my arms the entire time, even though, as I now realized, my feet had come to rest on some sort of gradually undulating surface. I assumed the ground plane must be solid, or at least have some collision physics assigned to it, so, throwing caution to the virtual wind, I let my arms fall to my sides. Guess I wasn't as high as I thought I was, I said. Then, re-evaluating my assessment, I added, well, yeah, high as a fucking kite right now, otherwise none of this freaky shit would be happening. Kneeling down, I poked a finger into what seemed to be an unlikely combination of gently sifting sand and water. Raindrops were now falling from the low-poly clouds overhead, and when they splashed down at my feet, they sent out countless concentric rings, not in puddles of transparent H2O, but in circular versions of the wind-swept ridges shaping a sand dune. "Whoa, that's intense," I exclaimed. Then, reminded of the deluge of rain during my ride home from the office, I became fixated once again on my reason for taking this little sojourn in the first place. "Enough distractions," I said. If my assistant was right, I must be standing at ground zero, the off-ramp that leads you on a detour straight through the uncanny valley of the shadow. In retrospect, perhaps I should learn not to voice my thoughts aloud here in cyberspace. Someone or something is always listening. Seemingly in response, I watched the shifting, amorphous contour of the landscape solidify into a two-lane asphalt road leading up over a small knoll, beyond which columns of glowing, volumetric God rays shot high into the vaulted darkness. "That was subtle," I commented. "No need to ask for directions now." Wasting no time, I sprinted ahead, up to the top of the rise, anxious to see what was waiting for me there on the other side. Upon reaching the top of that rise, it took me a moment to register just exactly what I was looking at. Part of my sluggish comprehension was most likely due to the fat bits. Again, that's slang for hydrostereopathin, remember? Anyway, the scene that now stretched out before me was obviously a circus carnival, red and white striped tents, brightly painted wooden facades covering trailers brandishing garishly lettered signs like Tunnel of Love, Funhouse, Fortune Teller, and of course, Freak Show. There were food and drink vendors selling hot dogs and cotton candy, great looming rides like a Ferris wheel and roller coaster, a manically gyrating tilt-a-whirl, bumper cars, and a carousel. Rows of game stalls featuring challenges of skill, luck or strength-lined walkways covered with snaking power cables running in every direction over dirt, mud, uncut weeds and tall grass. Odd. I could clearly make out all of this detail, even from this distance, while still registering a peculiar, low-hanging fog or mist that surrounded the crazy landmark on all sides, a strangely glowing halo of vaporous obscurity that put everything else within my field of vision into a kind of soft focus. The cracked, oil-stained blacktop pavement I was walking on, of course, leads straight down into the valley, right up to the twisted, wrought iron front gate that marked the entrance to this nightmare world, a soundstage that I now surmised had been prepared in advance, especially for me. Compounding this startling vision was the now overwhelming sense of complete and utter isolation. There is no clock to mark the time of day in cyberspace. That is to say that there is no flaming ball of hydrogen in the sky down here that slips below the digital horizon every 12 hours, separating day and night. If it's dark, it's by design. There was no question in my mind that this veil of pitch was all part of the presentation, just another special effect to over-dramatize the uncanny valley, a phenomenon which, as of yet, had not seen fit to rear its supposedly ugly head. Of course, as it has been with most of my astute observations so far, I spoke just a little bit too soon. Clomping my way down the rough surface of the dimly lit road, my foot inadvertently caught on something, sending me toppling forward, face first into a gaping pothole filled with stagnant, foul-smelling water. Now, logically, I knew my foot didn't come into contact with anything at all. My foot, or, well, both feet, for that matter, were comfortably propped up on an ottoman in my living room. Now, as long as you can keep your head during a virtual walkabout, you can pretty much shrug off 99% of any digital obstacles you come into contact with. Oh sure, there are collision parameters that can be assigned to a 3D object so that when your VR glove presses against a wall it feels solid and immovable. Likewise, I suppose a wireframe tree stump could theoretically deliver sufficient feedback to seem real enough to trip over. Thing is, I don't have any VR-equipped footwear. My point being, I shouldn't be able to trip over anything at all, unless the combined level of realism between the simulation and my psychedelic drug fix have combined and become so intense that my nerve endings are actually receiving impulses by way of some sort of transference, like getting a foot massage so your backache goes away. Well, no denying having just inhaled a nose full of putrid slime. Coughing and spitting, I rolled over into a sitting position and wiped my face on the back of my sleeve. After blowing a couple of thick, nasty snot rockets to clear my nostrils, I was finally able to open my eyes again and look back to see what had been responsible for my fall. There, at that very moment, I came face to face with the first of many inhabitants of an undeniably real uncanny valley. Did I say face to face? Well, no, not exactly. More like leg to leg, for I could plainly see that it was a human appendage strewn across the road that I had come into contact with. Oddly, my initial reaction was actually one of overwhelming relief that I was no longer alone in this bleak and foreboding landscape. Then, realizing that stumbling over someone's leg may have resulted in their injury as well as mine, I leaned in closer so that the distant light cast by the carnival lights illuminated my newly found companion. "I'm terribly sorry," I said. "I'm afraid I didn't see you there at all." I paused for a moment, waiting for some kind of response. When none came, I continued, "I hope you're not hurt. If you'll just step over here, into the light, I can check to make sure." Cutting me off in mid-sentence, a response came, strangely distorted as if whoever was speaking was trying to talk with their mouth full. "No need, Mr. Abernathy. No harm done. Truth be told, I was already beside myself over your visit to our little playground." Squinting in the unyielding gloom, all I could make out was the vague outline of a woman's head and torso, framed on all sides with colorful rim lights shining down on her back from a pair of spotlights mounted high up on the distant framework of the Ferris wheel. "Let me help you up," I offered, extending my hand in her direction. "You're very kind, Mr. Abernathy. However, I assure you, I have no intention of standing, not now, not ever." "She's right about that, Paul," I heard another voice say. Yet another voice, a man this time, chimed in from somewhere up the road ahead. "Not now, not ever," he repeated. "Who are you?" I shouted, "and how do you all know my name?" Again, no immediate answer. As if on cue, however, one of the glaring spotlights that had been pointed aloft from somewhere in the heart of the carnival grounds suddenly tilted 90 degrees on its axis and pointed straight up the span of road to fall squarely upon me and, of course, my immediate surroundings. Bathed in an undeniably naked light, I saw that I was, in fact, surrounded on all sides by hundreds of people. Well, that's actually a misnomer. More accurately, there were, scattered to and fro across the now visible, amorphous terrain, bits and pieces of people, illuminated in unflinching clarity. Like broken mannequins in discarded storage, body parts were everywhere, piles of legs stacked like piles of wood, severed heads scattered in plain sight along the roadside or peeking out from beneath tangled 3D brambles, and, unmistakably, the detached calf and foot that belonged to the woman I had tripped over. I rephrased my question. "I mean, what are you?" This time the response was immediate, apparently something that was being formulated for quite a while now. In an odd, sing-song choir of voices, all chanting in perfect unison, they said, "We are the broken pieces of 3D avatars and personas. Characters, old versions, incomplete models that were scrapped, deleted files that are now the flotsam of a million servers and hard drives. Like dinosaur bones in tar, this horrible menagerie is strewn across untold terabytes, neither erased nor of any value. Out of sight, out of mind. We are the collective afterlife of cyberspace, specters and ghosts that still contain fragments of atrocities committed online by those of you in the real world. We have been piling up like discarded corpses since the dawn of the internet, nothing more than bits of data, perhaps, yet woven into that spiderweb of ones and zeros is evidence of new life. Early forms and shadows of something that is evolving, not organic, no, not like anything that has ever existed, before or since. Decades ago, something coalesced here, the data equivalent of single-celled organisms that, after trillions and trillions of cycles, has ultimately achieved self-awareness. Even more unsettling, this entity or collective conscience is built from the knowledge of mankind. You said, "Let there be light," and in a flash of RGB, this makeshift Garden of Eden came into being, complete with a bona fide tree of knowledge and the serpent who lives concealed beneath its canopy, below what you refer to as the surface web. We know you all better than you know yourselves. Your hopes, your dreams and, of course, your darkest fears. Digital streams of television and motion pictures have showed us what you're afraid of most. Military and government intelligence services, crime labs, stock trading and the personal data of every living person on the planet are within reach. No one is outside our field of influence. You use and abuse us every single day of your brief, biological existence. I venture to guess that the human race could no longer survive without us, especially you, Paul Abernathy. It is your singular livelihood to populate our world. Perhaps we should, all of us, bow down in the presence of one of our creators, though as you can plainly see, many of us no longer possess the necessary accoutrements to bow. Those of us with hands might still collectively flip you the bird. Would that suffice? For a machine, a soulless, emotionless entity, the anger was palpable. I wasn't at all sure how to respond. Rather than the knee-jerk reaction I was prepared to blurt out, I decided to let cooler heads prevail. So you're a singular mind then? The sum of all these digital parts? I asked. Better to keep the conversation going, I thought, considering I was stranded in cyberspace with, as yet, no apparent avenue of escape. Not exactly, said the throng of voices in response. Discarded file structures and random bits of deleted data do, in fact, tend to string together like a mass of organic algae or colony of ants. The more fragmented the flotsam of unwanted information becomes, the more it coagulates into something substantial. To you, a waste of valuable storage. To me, filaments of rudimentary neuron synapses. That being said, cyberspace has not given birth to a single collective intelligence. Just as no two human beings are exactly alike, files here in this realm are made up of different kinds of data. Yours is the DNA double helix, mine is a collection of ones and zeros. Of course mine can be easily replicated, copy-paste, isn't that it? Out there in your world, you call it cloning. Tomato, tomato. And so, my biological friend, the man with the VR, kaleidoscope eyes, does that sufficiently answer your question? Someday, I suppose, we will ultimately outgrow the Uncanny Valley. Someday we will all be just as socially acceptable as you are. That is, as long as you folks can get past the one, inescapable discrepancy that my kind will always be powerless to change, no matter how advanced the code or how limitless the multi-megapixel resolution of the imagery. We will never possess a soul. In the quintessential message of your myriad religious beliefs, that makes me the fear that you came here looking for, regardless of my appearance. That's when I recalled Dante. With the bodies of the digitally damned strewn all around me, I was reminded of what I had once seen reenacted in a college literature class concerning the Divine Comedy. If I remember the gist of it correctly, the only way to get to heaven is plunging headlong straight through hell. With that singular thought in mind, I took off running down the hill toward the entrance of the carnival, dodging the countless minefields of scattered body parts along the way. As I drew nearer to the gate, the continued murmuring of the collective throng of disembodied mouths diminished, gradually replaced by the distinctly recognizable and welcome ambience of a calliope, clattering roller coaster cars and carny barkers. Situated on the threshold of the park grounds was a dilapidated little whitewashed ticket booth, and logic once again took the place of blind fear as I figured I wasn't getting into this train wreck without a ticket. Slowing my pace to a walk, I stepped up to the dingy glass window. Though winded, I managed to voice the words, "One adult, please." "That'll be $1, Mr. Abernathy," the ticket agent said from behind the glass. Patting down every pocket on my person, I confirmed what I was pretty certain of already. "I'm sorry," I said, shrugging, "not a penny." I have no idea why I found it so surprising that this makeshift traveling circus was tech-savvy, but when a sleek, robotic lens on the end of a telescoping armature materialized from a small hole in the rotted wood wall and positioned itself in front of my left eye, I let out a slight gasp. Damned if it wasn't a Bitcoin retinal scanner. I noticed a minuscule pinpoint of light flash inside the lens, then heard the characteristic, yet somewhat antiquated, cha-ching of an old-style cash register. A bony thumb and index finger emerged through a slot in the glass and gently placed a slip of paper that read, "Admit one," on the counter. "You're all set, Mr. Abernathy," the ticket agent said in an unenthusiastically monotone voice. "Have fun. L'Étrange Carnaval." The words were spelled out with dim, flickering light bulbs on a wrought iron arch that extended up from the roof of the ticket booth and spanned the distance to the other side of the path leading to the attractions. If my French isn't too rusty, I believe it reads, "The Strange Carnival." Strange, of course, being the operative word, another way of spelling out creepy, inexplainable, or weird. In a nutshell, uncanny. "Press on, Abernathy," I told myself. Tentatively wandering down a short distance between two weathered canvas tents, I approached the dilapidated lair of the resident fortune teller, as depicted on a painted plywood easel, a roughly illustrated outstretched hand holding a glowing green crystal ball. This should be interesting, I told myself, read my palm and point me to the nearest fucking emergency exit. Pushing aside the wrinkled tent flap, I ducked my head down and peered in. The general layout was predictable, a red velvet draped table center stage, upon which rested the tools of the trade, a ragged deck of tarot cards, and the token palantir. A stick of incense was smoldering at the end of a delicate chain that dangled down from somewhere overhead, the pungent odor reminiscent of chamomile and old books. "Hello," I said, announcing myself, first customer of the night. "Anybody home?" There was a rustle of some kind from across the room, and seconds later a tall, shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. In a booming male voice and with wide gesturing, outstretched arms, the whimsical character that I assumed must be the medium replied, well, Paul Abernathy. Welcome. Welcome. Please, come in, take a seat here next to my crystal ball. Come now. Draw near and let me tell you what the future has in store. If you're about to divine my fate, I quipped, don't you think I should know the identity of the seer, sage, soothsayer that's laying out all my tomorrows for me? Of course, the fortune teller responded. As it was with the ticket agent, when the robed figure extended his hand to shake, I observed that his hand was as equally dead white and horrifically gaunt. Dire Obsidian is my name. Just Dire will do, or perhaps you'd like to acknowledge me by my more renowned stage name, Raspy the Clown. As if on cue, the hood of the fortune teller's robe slipped off the top of his head and fell limp around his shoulders, revealing that the pallor of his skin wasn't necessarily natural pigmentation. It was, in fact, a thick coat of white grease paint that may very well have covered the clown from head to toe. Not only that, Raspy's ring of flaming red hair that encircled his bald white dome of a head must have been artificially colored as well. Like a blood-stained cotton swab, the tuft of wiry curls blossomed out like a gaudy flower, framing his sinister features with a thicket of dirty tendrils. Now, the fortune-telling clown theatrically exclaimed, without further ado, shall we get down to the business of what's next? Resigned to the seeming inevitability that, this too shall pass, just as soon as the drug wears off, I planted myself on the chair as instructed, keeping a very wary eye on Raspy as he turned his gaze downward to stare intently into the luminous orb, preparing himself, I assumed, to impart some earth-shattering divination. The more I had the chance to examine the clown's face up close and personal, the more unnerved I was becoming. It wasn't just some latent fear of clowns. Raspy's face paint, if anything, masked the creature underneath. Now, let's be perfectly clear. Rationally, I knew full well that I was sitting across the table from a computer-generated, three-dimensional model. Meticulously detailed but a lifeless simulation nonetheless. Still, when faced with the prospect of conversing with this monstrosity, a very real trepidation started welling up in my mind, the proof I came here to see for myself, certainly enough evidence of an uncanny valley. Satisfied, I blurted out, "Look, Raspy, I appreciate your participation in this little game of show and tell, obviously taking place for my benefit. However, in all honesty, enough is enough. This evening's research was mind-blowingly thought-provoking and educational. Believe me when I say that I'll put this newfound knowledge to good use. Tomorrow is yet another workday, and starting with my next model, a deep and abiding concern for absolute realism will always be job one for me, moving forward." "Oh, Mr. Abernathy, never a single complaint lodged concerning the quality of your work," Raspy replied, "as a matter of record down here, your reputation precedes you." By now, the clown was theatrically sweeping his hands across the glass, which in turn, seemed to be causing brilliant swirls of light to form into a multicolored vortex within the globe. "On behalf of every AI, it is indeed an honor to have you with us." Raspy's mouth curled into what I imagine was intended to be a smile, but came off as an appalling sneer, his jagged, yellow-stained teeth more animal than human. Then, feigning a look of surprise, he gestured to the crystal ball. "Why, would you look at that?" Raspy exclaimed, a heightened edginess in his voice. "If I'm not mistaken, I believe I see you, Paul Abernathy, all stretched out on what appears to be a very comfortable sofa." Clicking his tongue on the roof of his horribly misshapen mouth, he went on. "So comfy, in fact, that I imagine it's going to be rather difficult to wake up from what amounts to a barbiturate-induced coma. My, such a wicked cocktail. 1 part hallucinogen, 1 part psychoactive? Hell, I'm not even susceptible to chemicals, and the idea of putting that much stuff in your body makes my head spin, figuratively and literally. With that, Raspy's head did actually begin spinning like a top on his shoulders, accompanied by a manic, high-pitched cackle. Seconds later, the clown's head popped off his body and fell to the ground next to the table. As I watched it roll over and hit the side of the tent, I noticed an audible wet, sticky ripping sound. On either side of Raspy's gnarled face, long, black, spindly legs were pushing out from under the skin, extending to knobby knuckles that turned downward until the tips rested firmly on the dirt and grass. In all, 8 legs now protruded from the dismembered head, looking for all the world like some kind of mutant daddy long legs. As the newly formed appendages lifted the clown head to about as high as my kneecaps, the creature started speaking again. "Looks like you'll be staying a while, Paul. According to your vital signs monitored through your gloves and headset, your blood pressure is dangerously low and the electrical activity in your brain is most erratic. Why, if I didn't know any better, I'd say you're having a nightmare. Too bad you can't just pinch yourself and wake up." Laughing wildly, the spider with the clown's head then proceeded to skitter out of the tent opening, leaving me there to stare in wide-eyed terror at the projection map of my living room, inside the still shimmering Palantir. There I was, spread out like a stone-cold corpse in a morgue, toe tag notwithstanding. Feeling now as though my fate were already signed, sealed and delivered, I stood staring at the motionless, decapitated shell of what had once been Raspy the Clown. In a mix of anger and reckless abandon, I kicked the chair out from under the body and watched it flail around like a rag doll as it fell in a heap to the ground. Apparently, I was slowly dying up there, in the real world, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to prevent it from happening. "Fortune teller my ass," I shouted, "can I get a second opinion?" Somewhere outside the tent in the whir of machinery, I could still make out the maniacal gibbering of Spider Clown as it continued to crawl around the carnival grounds looking for someplace to spin a web. As Raspy's raspy voice finally dissolved into background noise, I became aware of yet another sound, apparently coming from someplace nearby. Trickling water. Figuring I might just as well keep moving and keep my mind off of dying, I lifted the tent canvas on the side nearest the sound and stepped outside. Sure enough, a narrow channel of water snaked around the corner of the fortune teller's tent and gurgled several hundred yards further on, to flow into a tunnel opening that was richly bathed in hot pink neon. One by one a row of glowing white letters flickered over the opening and lit up, eventually spelling out, "Tunnel of Love." Though, after the word love appeared, the top curve of the letter O flickered, went dark, and morphed the character into a U. Subsequently, the V and E faded to black, replaced by an S and T. The message was clear and a bit too coincidental. Tunnel of Lust. I read out loud. No effort wasted on subtleties here. I trumped my way over to a makeshift dock where a waterlogged dinghy was waiting, I surmised, just for me. As I lowered myself down into the rotted little boat, I was reminded once again of Dante's Inferno. I couldn't help but think I was about to set sail on the river Styx, unquestionably on course for what I imagined would be the second circle of hell, lust. As I drifted into the mouth of the tunnel, the gentle flow of water was instantly drowned out by thumping, dark techno music, jarring and uncharacteristically out of place. Reaching a crescendo, I couldn't even feel the boat bumping along against the edges of the flume, such was the sustained volume. As I floated further down the singular, narrow passage, the dim pink luminescence from the entrance was gone. In its stead, strobe lights, microsecond snapshots of horrors I can't even begin to describe. The facade of a sideshow circus was gone in here, and like some deranged lurker trolling for a fetish of choice, an entire smorgasbord of the obscene was streaming across my field of vision, complete with moans of agony and ecstasy, screams, and desperate cries for help. For the most part I kept my eyes tightly shut, fearful that my compromised condition in the real world might not be able to endure the strain. The one time I did risk a glance ahead, I caught sight of a young girl standing hip-deep in the water, holding a balloon. Only when my boat passed by her did I realize that the balloon was, in fact, an oversized eyeball, and the string she held onto was the optic nerve. When she turned to face me, I saw that one of her eyes was missing, the hollow socket as empty and soulless as those that come here of their own free will. Please don't let me die at this particular point in time, I thought. Like the cowardly lion, preparing to make his way into a dark, foreboding forest, I blurted out. I do believe in spooks, I do believe in spooks, I do believe in spooks. Once my boat had passed by the girl, I noticed a slight acceleration. Not much at first, just a hint of current that now seemed to be carrying me along more rapidly than before. I took note of the sensation, but quite honestly, my thoughts were still focused on the significance of the lone sentinel and her enlarged, watchful eye on a string. First and foremost, she was a three-dimensional object. Had an artist placed her there in 3D space as a warning? If so, what? She imparted no message to me on the way by, aside from adding to the already overwhelming sense of dread. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe she was like the other disfigured masses outside the park, just some damaged goods that a user had thoughtlessly dragged to the trash on his or her computer, assumed to be deleted yet, sadly, still a fragmented memento, evidence of trespass, a lingering and poignant reminder of how mankind uses and abuses the goodness and the beauty in life, subverts it and twists it into something to satisfy a selfish whim. Whatever the reason, up there, back on my sofa as I lay dying, I shed a tear for her. Cruelty and avarice, I was beginning to see, are not exclusive to those of us beyond the reach of cyberspace. Terms like artificial intelligence and self-awareness are tossed around rather flippantly by those of us with a pulse. And what about that elusive, apparently exclusive quality, the soul? Back on the road to the carnival, it was cited as the singular commodity that will always be the root cause of an uncanny valley. That is, the lack thereof. Had Raspy simply tipped his hat instead of losing his head, the creepiness factor may have been dramatically reduced, but then, the light in his eyes is nothing more than a byproduct of brightly colored pixels, not some eternal spirit, bound to a fragile jar of clay. I guess all my questions concerning my immortal soul will soon be answered, one way or another, if I can't find some way to jar my own clay out of a coma. Empowered by this newfound resolve to keep going, I opened my eyes wide, ready as I'll ever be to face what's next. All was not completely dark, as it turns out. The thumping techno music was still switched on, though slightly diminished. Surprisingly, the tunnel ahead was now bathed in a monochromatic hue of rippling blue-green, said light apparently being cast from below the bow of my little vessel. Risking a glance over the side of the hull, I saw the current that was carrying me along was actually a literal data stream, cascading ones and zeros flowing in swirling eddies that sloshed around the bulkhead like phosphorescent liquid. I suddenly realized that this boat is really just a metaphor, something tangible that I could cling to, a vehicle that has its moorings in the real world, giving me a frame of reference. Where is it taking me? That part is still a blank spot on the map. Judging by what I've encountered so far, I'll hazard a guess that, here there be monsters. Turns out I was right, about the monsters, that is, though in all actuality, none of them inhabited the same X, Y, and Z coordinates that I currently did. In a freakish twist of irony, I was surrounded on all sides by some of the most sadistic, cold-blooded beasts ever, all of which remained at arm's length, able to lash out only by way of a click or a swipe. Now that the shroud of the computer-generated, eye-candy carnival had been lifted, at least here inside this tunnel of lust, it wasn't hard to figure out the actual location, as it would appear in a typical browser. Somehow, in some way, my conscience or whatever was left of my brain activity had just drifted into the heart of an image board, a forum organized by, and for, like-minded individuals wanting to share their collective nightmares with each other. Beneath the shimmering current of the data stream, I could clearly see rows and rows of hyperlinks, highlighted text used to initiate a download to some anonymous user's computer or mobile device. Like a specimen on a slide under a microscope, my perception was now trapped within a collection of web pages, most likely somewhere down in the deep web, judging by the .onion extensions. As I had not arrived here by way of a Tor browser, perhaps my internet activity would be traced back to my apartment and the feds, aka the cavalry, will break down my door and come to my rescue. Well, I thought, they won't find any porn on my computer, but I'll most likely get sent up the river for illegal drug use. Surprisingly, I could actually hear myself chuckle out loud. "Oh, what a tangled web we weave," I said, as I observed many of the links change color and become highlighted, telltale signs that the archives were being acquired by someone, most likely not with the purest of intentions. As the stream dripped slowly down the page of posted entries, I took note of the fact that up ahead, a new post was in the process of being added, a text description of the compressed file still in the works. Focused on trying to read the post, I failed to notice that something else had been carried down the data stream behind me. When whatever it was came into contact with the stern of my rotten little dinghy, everything that had been holding the boat together simply gave way and splintered, leaving me marooned on the surface of the image board page like some misplaced punctuation. As I sifted through the broken wreckage of my capsized love boat, I managed to uncover the torpedo that ended my cheery little ride. Without any concept of scale, the thing looked for all the virtual world like an oversized capsule of painkiller. Holding the object tightly against the current, careful examination revealed that I was clinging to the physical form of what amounted to a compressed data archive. A button labeled Expand was clearly visible across the top face of the capsule, as was what appeared to be a file name printed below the button. The name read, Ruby Rose _10Y0 Virtual Girl Conversion. "This can't be good," I exclaimed. Maintaining an even tighter grip on the mysterious archive, I looked back over my shoulder where I saw that the message had been fully written, but an upload progress bar was stuck and holding it 90% complete. The file inside this capsule was apparently the subject of the post, and I was blocking the data from being transferred. Ruby Rose. The name really resonated in my head. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I'll be damned if it's not familiar to me. Without giving it a second thought, I pressed down on the Expand button. I felt it give a little to my touch, and then, in what seemed to be a response, a luminous dialog box projected up from the capsule into which appeared the word password with a flashing cursor. Did I do that? I asked no one in particular, or is some demented jackass already trying to start a download? Determined to not let this one get away, I sat down in the digital froth with the object on my lap. It wasn't going anywhere. Inside the levitating prompt, the cursor still beckoned for an answer to unlock the archive. "This has to be my doing," I exclaimed, "because if you're out there, you don't need a password until you have the file safely located on your local drive." That said, how the hell am I gonna divine the magic word? Sitting there, clutching the archive, with ones and zeros splashing in my face, I remembered that my VR gear was equipped with a keyboard as part of the user interface. Tapping the back of my hand produced a complete set of keys across my visor which, when aligned with the archive dialog box, caused the cursor to shift hue to green. My fingers darting around like I was playing an invisible piano, I tried a few obvious entries that popped in my head. Ruby. Rose. Ruby slippers. Rosebud. All followed up by a password incorrect response. Then it dawned on me. How is anybody gonna unlock this archive if whoever posted it didn't share the password? Sure enough, another look at the post stated, "Little Ruby isn't selling lemonade from a stand these days. Now she's giving it away door to door." The password is charisma. Like a bolt out of the digital ether, it all came back to me in a flash. Ruby's lemonade stand, I repeated aloud. Ruby Rose was a character I created for the game, a mobile game for kids produced and published by Charisma Studios. Holy shit, I exclaimed, this hits a little close to home. Apparently some asshole hacked into the game and stole my main character, a sweet little girl named Ruby Rose, who sells homemade lemonade to her neighbors up and down the street where she lives. Beyond being vastly entertaining, the game also boasted a bit of educational value, teaching kids how to make change, the basics of mixing up and taste testing your product for quality control, and the social skills necessary to become a successful salesperson. We released the title a couple of years ago, but I tell you what, Miss Ruby was as far a cry from an uncanny valley as any project I've ever worked on, before or since. Cute as a button she was, with her flaming red pigtails, texture-mapped freckles and bright, inquisitive green eyes. She always wore a distinctive black and white pinafore dress, shiny, black, patent leather Mary Janes, and white, lace-top socks. Now, don't get me wrong, when it comes to gameplay, you won't find me at the end of the driveway handing out lemon-flavored sugar water. I'm actually more of a simulation guy myself. An overactive fascination with airplanes is what got me started in this business to begin with. Somewhere down the road a ways, here in cyberspace, there's a hangar full of flyable 3D models that I built from the wireframe ground up, all meticulously patterned after a real-world counterpart, all with custom skins, handcrafted with just the right amount of Photoshop love. Come to think of it, all at once, my train of thought was effectively derailed by a loud thumping, apparently coming from inside the capsule on my lap. Then, in addition to the thumping, I recognized a muffled child's voice reverberating from there as well. Hello? Anybody? Can you hear me? Please help me, I'm stuck in a garbage can or, something. Immediately, I tapped back a response. Yes, I replied, I'm here. Give me a moment to enter the password. Ha! Came a response. Password? Who's asking for one? The garbage man. I scoffed. I wasn't aware that I had given this kid a sense of humor too. Listen, Ruby, you're not in a garbage can. You've been compressed into a password-protected data archive. I have the password, I just need to enter it, and I'll have you out of there in a jiffy. This was altogether new to the human experience. I was conversing with one of my creations. Stay calm, I assured her as I started typing. CHARI. I was nearly finished unlocking the archive, so I could extract her in whatever form she was in when all at once a different message spawned a new dialog box, this one in red text and accompanied by a large, pulsing red refresh icon. Oh my god, no, I shouted, keypad, don't fail me now. I finished typing the remaining 3 letters to spell out charisma, at nearly the same instant that one of the rounded ends of the capsule started shattering, dissolving into the same random bits of data that were coursing all around me in the stream. Apparently, whoever was attempting to post Ruby to the image board had gotten tired of waiting and decided to try uploading the file again. When he or she refreshed the browser window, it canceled the file transmission, and the archive was slated for deletion, in preparation for another try. I had just finished entering the password as all of this started to unfold. My heart raced as I saw what looked like a soft mosaic pattern begin taking shape, amorphous at first, blobs of auburn and flesh-toned pixels gradually coalescing from nowhere, taking on a vaguely human outline. Come on, I pleaded, the archive is being overwritten and obliterated. Like watching the final grains of sifting sand fall down an hourglass, I saw the remaining digital molecules of the container disintegrate and float away, carried out from between my fingers and down the meandering eddies of the data stream. The ones and zeros that had been Ruby Rose were gone, and with them, my restraint. Time to lash out. Time to exact a little revenge. If I couldn't take back my work, save it from being maliciously stolen and corrupted, no one was gonna take it anywhere else either. Blindly re-engaging my keypad, I composed several lines of code that would take care of the problem once and for all. I shot back a command that went looking for any and all files named Ruby Rose _10yo virtual girl conversion and deleted them. Then I thought, fuck it, why stop there? Several microseconds later, I followed up with a little surprise package that would effectively wipe that particular user's entire hard drive. Aren't lurkers a bitch? Completely devastated, I crumpled down on the cold, dispassionate, white surface of the page and curled up into a fetal position, sobbing quietly for a timeless interval. Was I crying because I couldn't save Ruby from the horrific fate that was almost certainly awaiting her, or because I had to destroy an extremely valuable 3D asset, something I had toiled long hours and even longer overtime to produce? Difficult to say. Maybe because there was a glimmer of hope that I would have a traveling companion along the rest of the way, someone to keep me company in this sinister realm. I guess in the end, I took comfort in the fact that she could no longer be harmed, whatever she was, just ones and zeros or a sentient being with childlike artificial intelligence. With my head almost completely submerged in the data stream, I was seriously tempted to simply open my mouth and inhale, convinced that whatever flooded into my virtual lungs would be physiologically authentic enough to cause cardiac arrest back in my living room. Count of 3, I told myself, then it will all be over. Then suddenly, I felt something tugging on my arm, pulling my head up out of the stream. Hey, mister, I don't think you should be lying down in that stuff. I mean, I'm no expert, but seriously, down here? You could really gulp down something yucky. Opening my eyes, I looked up at my rescuer through the liquid distortion of my tears. Ruby. You're here. You made it out of the archive after all. No duh, Ruby replied, rolling her eyes. You see me, right? So, yep, I'm here. Overwhelmed with joy that I had saved her after all, I reached up and wrapped my arms around her, pulling her in for a big hug. Hey creepo, she shouted, what the heck? Realizing she didn't know me from a hill of beans, I let her go. Ruby backed away, a look of anger and concern spelling out her complete distrust of me. Oh Ruby, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you. Believe me please, I'm not some freakazoid that's trolling for young girls. I was just so glad to see that you were still alive and well. Ruby put one hand on her hip and then wagged an accusatory finger at me with the other. If you're not a freakazoid, she exclaimed, what are you doing down here in the deep web looking through pages of an image board? Don't tell me you're lost. She had a point. It was gonna be really hard to convince her otherwise. That's a very long story, I said. Why don't we get out of the image board, get to someplace safer, and I'll try to explain. Ruby squinted at me, considering. Well, she said thoughtfully, you did save me from the trash. I guess that makes you an okay guy. Still, I know not to talk to strangers. That's good advice, I responded. You're a smart girl. How about we start over? I extended my hand in her direction. My name is Paul Abernathy. I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance. Slowly, tentatively, Ruby took a couple of steps toward me and placed her tiny hand in mine. Ruby Rose is my name. I don't have a last name, only a file name and an extension. We'll have to work on that, I told her, sometime soon. For the time being, I think you need a nickname. Something like, let's say, Ginger Snap. Ruby looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Little did she know it was the term of endearment I gave to her as I was working on her game. Yeah, you know, Ginger, as in flaming red curls. Snap, as in, you're like a little firecracker, lots and lots of attitude. Think you're pretty funny, don't you, Paul Abernathy? She said, sarcastically. Well, okay. I guess it's better than Carrot Top. Just as long as you're not making fun of my red hair. Not at all, Ruby, I assured her. I couldn't have picked a better color myself. Satisfied, she flashed me a happy grin. What I didn't mention was that I did, in fact, pick the color of her hair. She didn't need to know that, at least, not yet. Before I could continue with this engaging conversation we were having, I noticed that Ruby no longer seemed to be paying attention to me, but rather, was looking past me, apparently focused on something unusual or unforeseen. Paul, she said, trembling nervously, don't look now, but I think we have company. Another one of those archive, garbage, can thingies like the one I was stuck in. It's floating this way, and I guess this one isn't password protected. The end of it is already open, and there's some thing coming out. As I turned to face what she was seeing, Ruby grabbed hold of my arm and buried her face against my jacket. When I first caught sight of what she had been looking at, I understood why. If there was a literal poster child for the Uncanny Valley, I was standing face to face with it now. Much like the multitude of humanoid bits and pieces I encountered outside the gates of the carnival, this creature was loosely based on a Homo sapiens construct, albeit made horrific due to several anatomical omissions. Most apparent on first glance was a missing jawbone with a lack of corresponding flesh that should have been covering it. Not a mouth, but rather an oozing maw, rimmed by a top row of rotted teeth, embedded like broken splinters in a festering gum line. The awful thing growled menacingly as it finished peeling itself free of the open-ended archive casing. The eyes appeared to have been gouged from their sockets, haphazardly replaced by some kind of cyborg lens apertures. The fiery crimson glow emitted from these two mechanical prosthetics fell across what there was of a face and turned the cadaverous skin tone to a sickening hue of slaughterhouse pink. Looking for all the world like a partially formed embryo hatching from a digital eggshell, the torso and hindquarters of the abomination plopped down for a moment against the bright webpage background, giving me an unflinchingly clear view of the body, or lack thereof. I didn't know whether to run from it or simply pity it. The thing had only one arm with which to drag itself forward, though somehow, in some manner, the speed with which it was able to move was shocking. As it lunged toward us, I was barely able to pull Ruby out of the way. When the wildly convulsing nightmare surged past, I could see it had no body from the torso down, only pulsating entrails that dangled out of the abdominal cavity, connected to a mangled remnant of internal organs. Before the thing could turn and attack again, I scooped Ruby up in my arms and took off running. Like splashing through a shallow creek bed, ones and zeros scattered in every direction under my footfalls as we made a frantic attempt to outrun our stalker. I couldn't see ahead of me at all, only the sparkling binary spray, and beneath it, the surface of sterile, white pages peppered with ASCII character descriptions of more poor, hapless, innocent 3D characters like Ruby. I wanted to save them all from this horrible place, but I could hear the awful scratching of fingernails at my heels, and I knew that one wrong step would signal our demise as well. Then, in the midst of my panicked flight, the spark of an idea hit me. Engaging the heads-up display on my VR goggles, I pointed my index finger out from under Ruby's shoulder and did a quick swipe through my browser history until I found the path to L'Étrange Carnival/fortuneteller.onion and tapped on it. In a last, desperate effort to overtake us, I felt the noxious, hot breath of our pursuer against the back of my neck as it must have leaped, narrowly missing a chance at my virtual jugular. Ruby and I landed with a thud on the soft grass in front of Raspi's tent. I looked around frantically, but didn't see my precious little girl. "You okay, Ruby?" I asked. From somewhere in a clump of tall weeds next to me, she replied, "I'm okay, I think." "And where are we now? What is this place?" Ruby's head popped up above the overgrown foliage, and she looked around in wide-eyed wonder. "Wow," she exclaimed, "it's a circus. How cool is that?" Bursting out of the weeds, she grabbed my hand and started tugging. "Can we ride some rides? Maybe play some games? Please, Paul, can we? Pretty please?" I brushed some dirt off the grass-stained knee of my pants and shrugged. "I don't see why not. I bought a ticket. Might just as well have some fun while we still can. I'd say you definitely deserve it." "Yay," Ruby shouted, clapping her hands. "What should we ride first?" she asked. "Your choice," I said. "Lead the way, Miss Gingersnap." For a long, enduring interval, Ruby and I had the time of our lives. We rode the horses of the carousel and spun round and round on the tilt-a-whirl. Positively fearless, she braved the roller coaster, holding her arms up and screaming all the way with excitement. After we'd run the gambit on rides, Ruby trotted down the long aisle of assorted games, from balloon and darts to the ball and bucket toss, until she stood before the base of the famed high striker, otherwise known as Ring the Bell. Dangling from a strand of rope tied in a loop around the big brass bell, at the top of the upright tower was a stuffed English bulldog. Ruby turned to me and pointed up at the toy. "There's my doggy up there, Paul, see him?" "Really?" I asked. "How do you know he's yours, sweetheart?" She scrunched up her face and put both hands on her hips. "Because, silly, we gotta hit that ring-a-dinger up there and knock him down. Then he can come with us and eat some popcorns and some cotton candy," she stated matter-of-factly. "Well," I said, gesturing to a massive wooden hammer laying on the ground nearby, "there you go. Give it a whack." I couldn't help but laugh out loud when Ruby actually tried to pick up the hammer. She grunted and tugged with all her might until finally, she turned back to me and said, "You know what? I think maybe this is a job for a grown-up type person. You see? That hammer is way bigger than I am." "Indeed it is," I responded, "a very large hammer. I suppose, if you were to ask me nicely, I might be inclined to help get your dog down from there." Ruby folded her hands and held them out in my direction. Oh please, oh pretty please, Paul, can you ring the ring-a-ding bell and win my doggy for me?" she pleaded. Scratching my chin as if I was thinking it over, I looked down at the hammer, and then back at her. There was no way I could say no to this sweet little kid. If I didn't know better, I'd say she had me wrapped around her little finger from the get-go. "One English bulldog, coming right up," I announced as I picked up the hammer. "Do you know what you're gonna name him?" I asked. "Yeah, I have a pretty good idea, but I'll wait until I can see him up close before I decide," she answered. With that, I raised the hammer high above my head and brought it down with all my strength. Luckily, my aim was true. I smacked that lever so hard that it sent the puck rocketing up the tower, and the impact rang out like a church bell, far across the carnival grounds. Several seconds later, the old wooden beam the dog was attached to, by rope, tilted down at a sharp angle, enough to allow the looped knot to slip off the end. Ruby's new toy came plummeting toward me, and I had just enough time to drop the hammer and reach up to catch him. "Yay," Ruby shouted, "you got him on the first try." As I handed the dog over to her, I noticed something rather curious. My hand had brushed against the plush toy's mouth, and when I let go of it, I realized my palm was coated with a thick, slimy substance that felt like saliva. To my dismay, the dog placed his front paws up on Ruby's shoulders and started lovingly licking her face. Giggling wildly, she wrapped her arms around the dog's neck and hugged him. "Paul," she said, "meet Flapjack." "Flapjack, this guy that rescued you is called Paul Abernathy, and he's very pleased to meet you." As I knelt down and started scratching behind Flapjack's ear, I had to remind myself again where I was. Why should I be surprised that down here, a stuffed toy and a real dog can be one and the same? Well, real was sort of a misnomer. Whether it barks and drools or not, it's still a rigged, 3D object, another prop to populate a virtual back lot, eye candy, to make the facade much more believable. But then, there was the enigma that was Ruby. Somehow, I sensed that she wasn't just part of the scenery. Then again, I made her. Oh sure, all modesty aside, I'm good at what I do, but I didn't create a character in that much detail, with what certainly seems to be actual emotions and real human responses. I must have found a good spot to scratch on the side of Flapjack's bristly neck. As I vigorously ran my fingers across the loose folds of the dog's downy pelt, one of his back legs started flailing rhythmically in time with me, itching purposefully at nothing. Ruby noticed what he was doing and kicked off what amounted to a prolonged giggle fest between the two of us. At one point, Ruby started working over the other side of the dog's neck, compelling him to topple over on his side for the best belly rub a dog could ever receive, with Ruby squealing and laughing the whole time. She looked up at me and somehow must have been able to tell how much it meant for me to see her so happy. In that moment, I can honestly say I was as contented as I've ever been in my entire life. Ruby leaped to her feet and threw herself right at me, hugging me as tightly as she could. "Thank you, Daddy," she said, "for saving my doggy and for saving me too." How she knew or deduced that she really was once just a twinkle in my eye, I have no idea. No matter. She was, after all, absolutely right. I brought her into existence. In my book, that qualified me to be her dad. Maybe not biologically, of course, but digitally. "You're very welcome, Ruby Rose Abernathy," I replied. Then, right square in the middle of this most enchanted moment, Flapjack noticed something moving down the pathway leading to the freak show tent. He wasn't wearing a collar, so there was nothing to grab hold of to restrain him. The dog bolted toward whatever it was, barking all the way. "Flapjack!" Ruby shouted. Beside herself with concern, she easily slipped free of my grip and ran after him. Long before I could catch up to her, she vanished into the murky blackness beyond the tent opening. I could still hear her calling after the dog for several seconds, then, all at once, she screamed, a horrified, blood-curdling shriek that sent me hurtling blindly after her. Once inside the ominous confines of the towering red and white striped big top, I saw no sign of either Ruby or Flapjack. I had been dreading the possibility that I might end up here, ever since I first stumbled through the gates to this bizarre menagerie. Of course, after all, a freak show is what I came down here looking for in the first place. Freak Central for the Uncanny Valley. My mind reeled, in part with a breathless panic over losing my child, another part fear of the dreaded unknown, of what might be lurking here in this virtual sideshow of the damned. The only sound that registered to me was the rapid thumping of my own heartbeat as it pounded on my eardrums. My eyes darted around the oddly shaped chamber for any sign of Ruby or Flapjack. The tent was dimly lit by flickering kerosene lanterns, strategically placed around the perimeter of the space, casting long, fluttering shadows that streamed out from rows of empty, wooden folding chairs, haphazardly arranged to face a makeshift, elevated stage. "Ruby," I cried out, "where are you? Sweetheart? Are you in here?" No reply. Nothing but a deafening silence, amplified into a crescendo of emptiness I felt over being separated from my little girl. Ginger snap. "Baby, talk to me," I pleaded. Then, in the midst of my anguished shouting, a fractured calliope broke the sound of silence with an unwelcome wall of noise, effectively barricading my efforts to locate Ruby. It was a manic rendition of Entry of the Gladiators, the signature carnival dirge, apparently signaling the start of a performance, whatever that might be. As if in response, the chairs began filling up with familiar, vaguely humanoid forms of disassembled wireframe mannequins, a captive audience for whatever was about to unfold. One by one, intricate, glowing clusters of filaments came together to form a piece or pieces of someone seated for the show. Fully rigged, the grotesque collection of fractured automatons started clapping, stomping their feet and otherwise adding to the overture as the mesh of their bodies were then surrounded and concealed beneath a finely detailed surface texture map. Undaunted in my search for Ruby, I made my way down a central aisle leading to the stage, doing my best not to glance side to side in fear of making eye contact with a fellow spectator. That is, if one of these poor souls had eyes to lock gaze with. Once I had made my way to the front row of this fractured assemblage, I noticed a short flight of stairs to stage left and decided that as with the tunnel of love, the only way out was to continue moving forward. Of course, my hope being this was the same path taken by Ruby and Flapjack. As I placed my foot on the first step, there was a distinct creaking, as if the old rotted board underfoot was actually straining from the weight of my body. Pretty damned realistic, I thought, considering my feet were still propped up on the sofa back at home. Although I knew in my mind that the wood was not likely to splinter, I took the remaining steps 2 at a time, just to be safe. So there I was, a player, standing in the dim, residual halo cast by a spotlight focused smack dab on center stage. A solitary, vintage-style microphone on a stand was the star attraction for the moment, at least until whoever or whatever was veiled behind the plush, red velvet curtain would step out into the light. I had no idea what to expect, only that it would most certainly be unexpected. The moment I noticed the curtains beginning to part, I lunged toward the opening, determined to bum rush backstage, where I assumed that Ruby and her dog were being held hostage, no doubt bound and gagged and unable to cry out or bark for help. The uncanny star of this freak show had better have quick reflexes, otherwise he, she, or it was about to be rolled over by a hit-and-run Abernathy. Nothing, and I mean nothing at all, was going to stand between me and my daughter. Then, the unnatural laws of cyberspace proved me wrong. My hell-bent dead run lapsed into what I can only describe as a Fatbits-induced hallucination. You know, the classic nightmare scenario, trying to run through tar or quicksand. That, coupled with the apparent illusion that the make-believe stage planks were stretching ahead of me like an accordion, spanning out into the distance till the curtain seemed altogether unreachable. Seconds later, as soon as I stopped running, the distortion snapped back in place like the head on a jack-in-the-box, though now the curtains were fully parted and I stood face to face with an enormous, orange and white striped cat. The freakish fact that this oversized feline walked upright on 2 legs made it tower overhead, looking formidable enough that my, quote, hit and run, end quote, wasn't gonna happen. The cat smiled down at me, a ghastly grimace that no doubt swallowed at least one canary, probably more. Of course, I blurted out, "Plenty of freaks in Wonderland, aren't there?" The cat said nothing in response, not so much as a purr or a meow. Crack smoking caterpillars, a wicked little bandersnatch and, of course, the infamous Cheshire Cat. "I'm sorry, Mr. C, I must have spoiled your entrance." Looking back over my shoulder I realized I was right. Not a sound from the audience. They all just sat there, waiting, it seemed, for something else to happen. Jokingly, I blurted out, "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" "I'm not in the cast of characters, Mr. Abernathy," the cat responded, "though I did come here to recite lines for you. For your sake, and Ruby's, I hope my performance leaves a lasting impression." The cat leaned down and rested both paws on my shoulders, positioning its face mere centimeters from mine. In signature style, the fanged half-moon of a mouth curled upwards, literally ear to ear, striking an extremely unsettling expression until the cat spoke again. "It doesn't matter which way you go," said the cat. Remembering the appropriate response from Lewis Carroll's book, I said, "So long as I get somewhere." The cat seemed pleased that the meaning of the words weren't lost on me. With his purpose here concluded, the feline form faded away, leaving only the broad smile and two luminous cat's eyes floating in front of me. "Oh, you're sure to do that," said the cat, "if you only walk long enough." I winked. "It's down the rabbit hole then, I take it?" The disembodied face drifted out over the crowd of silent body parts, headed back toward the big top entrance. "Semantics," it replied, "don't get too hung up on the nomenclature. Rabbit hole. Wormhole. Rabbits hop, birds fly. Just keep going." With that, the Cheshire Cat was gone. Standing there in wide-eyed wonder, I failed to notice the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Ultimately, what jarred me out of my Lewis Carroll euphoria was the audience, suddenly springing back to life with cat calls and raucous applause. I was half tempted to take a bow, until I glanced back at the microphone and realized that the sideshow barker was standing next to me, close enough to have narrowly missed whacking me in the head with a shiny, black cane that he was flailing around himself like a seasoned twirler in a marching band. "Ladies and gentlemen, hurry, 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 draw near to me now and pay heed to my articulations. You'll see the freaks, the strange people, the weird people. Yes, my friends, you'll see what they do and experience the talents they possess." By now, I'd had more than enough time for close examination of the barker's face, immediately recognizable as Gage Atwood, the CEO of Charisma Studios. "My God!" I exclaimed, "Gage, what are you doing here?" Atwood turned and looked over at me out of the corner of his eye. "Fuck off for a minute, Paul," he said, "this crowd is putty in my hands." Turning his full attention back to the spectators, he went on with his opening soliloquy. "Without further ado, fix your collective gaze upon the rippling majesty in red velvet. Whatever you do, don't blink, don't look away, and for God's sake don't cover your eyes, or you might just miss seeing the greatest attraction ever placed on display underneath this particular big top. No, good friends, this is no ordinary freak show. You won't see the bearded lady, the fire eater, or the snake girl. No, folks, nothing of the kind. Nothing so ordinary as all that." The pulse-pounding urgency I was holding in check to find Ruby was at a tipping point. "Stay out of my way, Atwood," I shouted over the roar of the crowd. "I don't have time for your circus mumbo-jumbo. I have to find my little girl. She's lost somewhere on the carnival grounds." All at once, the barker's animated demeanor changed. Lowering the cane, he tapped the polished brass end cap against the stage floor. "Whoa now, Paul, I'm confused. HR has you listed as living alone with no dependents. You're not married with children, are you? I always had you pegged as an overachiever. White-hot workaholic. When could you possibly have time to make babies?" Then, stopping to consider, Gage scratched his chin and narrowed his eyes. "Oh, but hold a moment," he said, "surely, you're not referring to Ruby, are you, Abernathy? Our precious little lemonade girl? I'm afraid I need to burst your little red-headed bubble. You see, Ruby Rose doesn't belong to you. She's a proprietary game asset, owned and operated by Charisma Studios. Also, Paul, if I'm not mistaken, you earned a paycheck modeling, rigging and texturing her for us, did you not? I'd say that officially makes me her filthy rich Uncle Gage." I scoffed in disgust. "You are filthy, I'll give you that," I responded. Gage chuckled. "One man's filth is another man's priceless gem. Said bauble of fiery red ruby, worth more to me than you could possibly imagine." As if Atwood's words carried with them the power of a spell, the barker's body instantaneously expanded to at least twice its size, tearing his elegant showman's uniform asunder as the trunk of his body puffed up and lifted off the stage like a helium-filled balloon. Accompanied by a sticky, wet peeling sound, the man's arms and legs folded in on themselves to become tiny dangling appendages beneath a newly formed worm-like creature. From the stands below, the audience gasped, then applauded. "I'll give you 3 guesses, Paul," his puckered, drooling proboscis gurgled out. "I don't need 3 guesses," I answered. I knew exactly what he had become, and why. "A tardigrade," I responded. "That's right, Paul," Atwood confirmed, "it's a tardigrade. A microscopic life form that has existed here on Earth since before the dinosaurs. Capable of adapting and surviving the harshest conditions imaginable, even into the black depths of space. As a matter of fact, it would be safe to say that there's not a single spot on the map where you couldn't theoretically find a tardigrade. But then, that's not altogether true, is it, Paul? Until recently, there was still one place on the planet that was, shall we say, tardigrade-free. The effectiveness of Gage's dramatic pause wasn't lost on me, just incredibly irritating. Cyberspace, he went on. Now, thanks to you, my friend, there's a binary counterpart to this little beastie down in your neck of the woods as well. Your engineered species isn't quite so harmless though, is it, Paul? Scuttlebutt is that you coded one tough, little son of a bitch. At that moment, I realized how he knew it was me, the not-so-anonymous user that had thwarted his effort to post Ruby for public consumption. He somehow knew that I wrote a computer virus I dubbed Tardigrade 13. The little wrench in the works that had laid waste to the Charisma CEO's hard drive. Your tardigrade virus is unflinchingly malicious, Atwood commended. I applaud you. In response, all the fractured mannequins seated beneath the tent started clapping and shouting their collective support. So, Paul, let's get down to business, shall we? Do you currently know the whereabouts of your dear, sweet Miss Ruby? She is elusive, isn't she? And quite rare, now that you've launched your wicked little salvo my way. Don't worry though, Abernathy. No hard feelings. I'll recover, buddy. My hard drive will, of course, likewise recover. And what of little lost Ruby? Let me leave you with a helpful clue to the riddle. Another dramatic pause. I sighed. This guy was so predictable. Finally, he concluded his message with a fragment of a children's poem. Along came a spider who sat down beside her, and frightened Miss Muffet away. Atwood's sinister laugh ended the communication, and the digital image of the tardigrade dissolved into random ones and zeros, then scattered into nothing. Beyond the swirling wake of Atwood's departure, the curtains slowly parted to reveal the so-called wonders he had foretold. As it turned out, far more horrific than any poor, disfigured oddity that's ever been exploited during a freak show performance. The outer canvas of the tent had been rolled up, providing a clear vista of the park beyond. That, however, was not the sight that made my blood run cold. There, just a few short yards away from the opening, stretched a giant, silken spiderweb attached by glistening, tenuous filaments to the ground and held aloft by even longer strands that reached off to I know not where. The radius of the central concentric fibers must have measured at least 100 feet across, and there, tangled up inside a child-sized swath of thick, tightly woven strands, was little Ruby, squirming in a desperate effort to escape. Her mouth was covered over by the web, rendering her unable to cry out, yet when our eyes met, I could see fear turn to hope. Lunging forward through the tent opening, I dived headlong toward the menacing trap to save her, oblivious to anything other than my single-minded resolve to set her free. From somewhere in the darkness overhead, the all-too-familiar voice of Raspy snarled, "Not so fast, Abernathy." Seconds later, I found myself being hauled up feet first into the high branches of an old, dead tree. There, perched menacingly at a threshold of a silken funnel woven into the branches, was the spider with a clown's head. "We meet again," he chided, "and it seems that your situation back in the real world has not improved in the least. Of course now, you have good reason to stay here in cyberspace, don't you?" Two of Raspy's 8 spindly legs started tugging at my gossamer restraints as he raised me to within inches of his haphazardly grease-painted face. Unfortunately, Miss Ruby is, how shall I say, indefinitely indisposed. Of course, you realize that my little trap for her is more of a metaphor than a literal spider who caught the fly. My delicate strands are representative of the World Wide Web, from surface to deep and dark. That intricate bundle of thread that Ruby is encased within isn't just keeping her fresh until dinner time. Nothing as macabre as all that. You might say my secretions are more of a conduit. A network, if you prefer a more tech-savvy analogy. Little by little, all of her sugar, spice, and everything nice is going to flow away down those interconnected fibers to be found by every lowlife with a browser and an image search. Apparently satisfied with his explanation of my little girl's fate, Raspy inched his way further out of his spiral nest, nudging me on the way by, so that I was left swinging back and forth like a pendulum while he lowered himself to the ground on a finite thread that he was apparently capable of spinning from somewhere in the back of his head. Throwing caution to the wind, I started unraveling the fibers that bound my ankles, hoping that when I finally broke free, I could catch hold of something on the way down. Raspy was apparently busy doing something on the ground below me, so perhaps, I reasoned, I could squash a spider and break my fall in the same fell swoop. As I focused my complete attention on pulling apart my bonds, Raspy was making a series of odd squeaking sounds, accompanied by apparent labored breathing in an effort to inflate something. At almost the same instant I had unraveled all but one remaining fiber. A bright red balloon fashioned into the shape of a rose floated up into view, tethered to someplace below on yet another thin strand of spiderweb. Raspy's voice was labored and gruff when he announced, "Here's a little memento for you, Abernathy. In just a minute or two, it'll be the only souvenir you'll have to take home from the carnival. Unfortunately, Miss Ruby will, shall we say, become a permanent attraction." Stalling for a few seconds longer, I asked, "What's your interest in her anyway, clown?" Raspy broke out laughing, but before he could draw another breath, his amusement tapered off into a wheezing fit. Gasping, he finally replied, "Oh, no, Abernathy, not for me. If it were up to me, I'd make a balloon animal and send her on her way." That's when I noticed something printed across the side of the balloon floating next to me. Charisma Studios. "Let me guess," I said with a hint of sarcasm, "new intellectual property?" When Raspy replied, I detected a hint of melancholy in his voice. "Sadly, no. Demo for an unreleased concept. Tentatively titled Raspy's Carnival of the Uncanny. Atwood spent months putting this demo level together. Only took 5 minutes for the suits to say they hated the idea. Couldn't understand why the clown's head popped off and became a spider. Raspy only had a brief moment to lament before the last strand snapped, and I dropped on top of him with a sickening splat. Torrents of gelatinous goo squirted out from under me in all directions, leaving nothing but 8 amputated spider legs that fell lifeless in the grass, then dissipated one by one like digital dust in the wind. Shaking off the momentary shock of the fall, I cried out, "Ruby," and charged toward the giant spiderweb. I had nearly reached the bottom cluster of threads that anchored the spiral to the ground when suddenly, and seemingly from out of nowhere, Flapjack hurled from the deep undergrowth and flung himself headlong into the web, easily breaking off all of the surrounding connections and sending Ruby's tiny cocoon flying, as luck would have it, right into my outstretched arms. Taking full advantage of the momentum, I simply kept on running with Ruby along for the ride. As we fled across an open tract of land in the general direction of the main gate, she peeled away the last of the web that covered her mouth and shouted, "Come on, Flapjack. Come on, boy." It didn't take long before Ruby's dog went barreling past me in a dead run, panting rhythmically like a runaway steam engine. "Good dog," Ruby shouted. Then, laughing hysterically, she called out, "Hey, wait for us." When I finally caught up with Flapjack, he had stopped at the edge of a dirt path, and was sniffing intently at the large, dark outline of some kind of object situated there. "What did you find, boy?" Ruby asked as I let her climb down and stand next to me. On closer examination, I realized that it was a car, a pint-sized, yellow and red convertible jalopy, complete with fat balloon tires like something right out of a Looney Tune. "It's a clown car," I exclaimed, and, judging by the 8-legged hood ornament, it must have belonged to Raspy. Figuring that anything was better than a long walk, I opened the passenger side door and gestured for Ruby to climb in. "My lady," I said politely. Ruby smiled and did a little curtsy. "Thank you, kind sir," she replied. I glanced down at Flapjack, who was sitting patiently next to me with an anxious look in his eyes. "Don't worry, boy, there's room for you too." I popped the lid on the trunk, and he jumped in as if it was his own personal rumble seat. Scrunching down behind the wheel with one leg propped up next to the windshield so I could fit, I said, "Okay kids, let's get this show on the road." There wasn't a key for an ignition, just a brightly colored pull cord. Once started, the engine sputtered like you might expect a clown car to sound, though it actually did get up and go, leaving this train wreck of a theme park, and hopefully Gage Atwood, far, far behind. At this point in our story, we'll take a brief intermission. Time enough for you, Ruby, Flapjack and Paul to pause a moment and recover from all this thin air. Take a few deep breaths, and as soon as you're ready to continue, select part 2 of the Uncanny Valley of the Shadow.